We have a fabulous panel of speakers. We started our conversations last night and have been discovering all sorts of fun things. And the great thing about this panel is our four panelists didn't really know each other coming into this, but there's all sorts of connections and threads that we're gonna pull out and talk about as we talk about the future of work. Which, you know, I guess depending on your perspective, if you're looking forward to having some time off, maybe the idea of robots coming to take everyone's jobs doesn't sound so bad. But unlike this morning, and this is a little bit unusual for me, I'm usually the one talking the gloom and doom about climate change. And instead today, I have the job of talking about something that everybody's already really freaked out about and really concerned about. In 2014, Pew asked about 2,000 experts what they were thinking about the future of work. And I want to read a little excerpt from their summary. Half of these experts, 48%, envision a future in which robots and digital agents have displaced significant numbers of both blue and white-collar workers, with many expressing concern that this will lead to vast increases in income equality, masses of people who are effectively unemployable, and breakdowns in the social order. The other half of the experts who responded to this survey, 52%, expect that technology will not displace more jobs than it creates by 2025. So I think one important thing to talk about is they're thinking about a pretty near-term future here. And there is a lot of concern about the future of work, and in particular, this issue of automation. But as I think you'll hear from a lot of our panelists today, that's not the only thing to be concerned about. In fact, it may not even be the biggest concern when it comes to the future of work. And there's a lot that we've been getting wrong with the way that we work and the way that our labor markets and labor systems have been structured. And I was struck this morning, my colleague Marguerite Egan, writing in the Boston Globe, quoted Winston Churchill, "Trust Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else," which I think if there's a takeaway from this morning's panel, it's maybe that's not just an American thing, maybe that's also a human thing, because the right thing tends to be often a harder thing than what's right in front of us. And so we're going to hear from our panelists today about a lot of the very hard work that they're doing to make work better right now and moving into the future. And because we're getting a little bit of a late start, I don't want to take too much time with me talking. We have four experts here. And you all have their biographies in front of you. So instead, to introduce them, I asked them a question, which is, what is the hardest job you have ever done? And so first up, we are going to hear from Greg Asbed. He's a 2017 MacArthur Fellow, co-founder of the Fair Food Program. And he says the hardest job that he's ever done is watermelon picking.
Thanks. I think we begin with the video.
"5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her two small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey! Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now and says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
He
told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way.
I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming, this is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
The most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amaryl Walker, CNN.
That's an incredible story, and something that is being told in more and more workspaces across the country today, but we'll get to that. First, let me start by saying what a joy and honor and how it brings me back to my childhood to be speaking at WGBH. Bill had mentioned Zoom as one of his childhood favorites, and it was one of my jams too when I was a kid, as the kids say these days. Masterpiece Theater, but Nova and Frontline today, it's just an incredible place, and to be here is fantastic. I can imagine Alistair Cook sitting in one of these chairs over there and looking at me and giving me a little nod. Anyway, so in honor of WGBH's love affair with science and learning, I want to start with a thought experiment today, if you would join me. So picture yourselves in a car and you're driving down a long country road. There's nothing but farms on either side as far as the eye can see. And you round a bend and you come upon a classic roadside farm stand. Right? And since you love local organic produce, you pull in. You step into the stand in the shade and you come upon rows of freshly picked sweet corn and red ripe tomatoes and crisp, cool watermelon cut up in little slices so you can try it. And the smell of the fruit just envelops you. So you grab some bags, you fill them with all you can carry, and you head to the register. And the cashier greets you with a smile and begins to ring up your purchase. Everything is perfect, just like you love it. Suddenly a horrible scream rips through the air, and it's coming from the field just over the cashier's shoulder where all that perfect produce was picked. And you look up, and you see a woman, a farm worker, in the back of a pickup being assaulted by her boss. And then the field comes into view and you see another worker on his knees, a drinking cup on the ground by his side, struggling to shield the blows of his boss, who's saying, you come here to work? Did you come here to drink water, you lazy mother? And just then, the cashier looks up and says with a smile, that'll be $27.50 cash or credit. What would you do? Would you complete your purchase, go back to your car, and go on about your day? No, of course not. And that's empathy, a rare, all too rare part of our lives at work. It's the human quality that does not allow us to simply walk away when another human being is being brutally abused, especially when that abuse is somehow for our benefit. You might intervene, you might call the police, but the last thing you would do is to turn your back and complete your purchase. And yet, the fact is that's what we do every day. We all turn our backs on farm worker abuse every single day, because every day in this country, farm workers go to work knowing they may be facing wage theft, physical and verbal abuse, sexual harassment, even sexual assault, even modern-day slavery, forced labor under the threat of violence or violence without pay. And every day, we go to the supermarket to buy our fruits and vegetables without giving a single thought to those conditions. Because the beautiful, sparkling produce aisles where we buy our food at Trader Joe's or wherever else it might be are light years removed from the fields where the harvesting and the abuse take place. Out of sight, out of mind, because the multi-billion-dollar food companies that sell us our food prioritize quality and price over human rights. That's why it's so common that we overlook farm worker abuse today. That's why 80% of farm worker women report being assaulted in the fields or facing sexual harassment. And that's why farm work is the third most dangerous job in the country today. And that's why they called Florida ground zero for modern-day slavery. Federal prosecutors who prosecuted over 12 modern-day slavery operations in the past decade in Florida. But it doesn't have to be that way. Picture yourself back in that country road, and the farm this time is entirely different. Instead of workers being assaulted by their bosses, you see workers gathered under a tent, learning about their rights. Other workers are taking in a meeting with the supervisor, talking about health and safety issues, while other workers are working at a humane pace in the fields. And as you pay for your food, the cashier sets aside a little bit of the money into a box called bonus. And you ask, what's up with that? And she said, oh, the workers get that at the end of the week, on top of their regular pay. Now that's not a dream, that's a reality. That's the new reality that we have built in the Fair Food Program in Florida and all the way up in states all the way up to New Jersey. The Fair Food Program is a unique partnership among farm workers, farmers, and retail food companies. That is a win-win-win proposition for all three. For farm workers, it protects their fundamental human rights. For farmers, it stabilizes their labor supply and increases their productivity. While for retail brands with global supply chains and brands that they have to protect the reputation of in the marketplace, it provides risk management for their brand's reputation. Today, that program has expanded beyond the East Coast and is being picked up by other companies, other organizations across the country and across the globe. But it wasn't always that way. In the year, let me take you back to the turn of the century. My son likes to talk about how I was born in the last century. Let me take you back to the turn of the century of the 21st century, specifically to the year 2000. The CIW is on the verge of a momentous pivot. For nearly a decade, we have been fighting the growers in sort of street battles and the farm bosses that run the work in the fields. We organized community-wide general strikes involving thousands of workers. We organized marches across the state of Florida. We helped organize those slavery prosecutions, the dozen slavery prosecutions over the past 15 years. And we even had a 30-day hunger strike by 6 of our more courageous members. But after nearly 10 years of pitched battle, we figured out that wealthy growers can always outlast dirt-poor farm workers in a strike. And as for slavery, we eventually figured out that successful prosecutions did not constitute success in the fight against forced labor. Instead, we sent more than a dozen farm bosses to prison with sentences of up to 30 years and helped liberate over 1,500 workers. But at the same time, the tomatoes picked by enslaved workers continued going to market without a hiccup. We wanted to end slavery, exploitation, and physical abuse in the fields once and for all, not just treat it after the fact. So we stepped back and we took a long look at the food industry as a whole. We expanded our analysis beyond the farm gate and looked at the industry from the consumers and corporations at the very top down to the farmers and farm workers at the bottom. And what we found was that these multi-billion-dollar farm corporations, or retail food corporations, had consolidated their purchasing power over the years. So today they buy tomatoes, for instance, with the combined purchasing power of tens of thousands of stores and restaurants around the country. And just like if we go to the store and we buy the big box of cereal rather than the small one, we get a better price. These retail food corporations leverage their volume purchasing power to demand lower and lower prices from the growers. It's the same market principle at work. And this in turn forces the growers to cut their costs, which causes to sustain business, which causes them to cut wages and working conditions for farm workers first and foremost. This new analysis of the food industry led us to develop a new theory of change. We realized that rather than fighting growers for an ever smaller slice of the pie, we're going to have to make common cause with consumers in order to demand a new kind of food, fair food. That's why in 2001, this unknown organization from a tiny, dusty crossroads town in Florida declared a national boycott of Taco Bell, telling anyone who would listen that Taco Bell makes farm workers poor. And that was a clunky slogan, but we were just getting started. For the next decade, we organized consumers from Maine to California through the Campaign for Fair Food. We demanded the retail food giants do two things, that they sign a legally binding agreement with the CIW to do two things. First is to pay a small premium that goes to the workers to improve their wages. The second is to only buy from growers who are in compliance with a human rights-based code of conduct drafted by workers themselves. When you say only buy from growers, that means stopping buying from growers who are not in compliance with human rights. And that is the key to real change. 10 years later, in 2011, we launched a fair food program in the Florida tomato industry, the industry formerly known as Ground Zero for modern-day slavery. And today, the program is spread up the East Coast as far as New Jersey. 14 corporations on board, including Taco Bell, McDonald's, Whole Foods, and Trader Joe's. And we're expanding into new crops in new states, heading west to Texas and ultimately California. Our dream of a world without victims is today a reality for 35,000 workers, a reality captured in that video by the CNN crew and in Alejandrina's story. Through a unique combination of labor rights education, worker-led monitoring, and market-based enforcement, with real teeth, the Fair Food Program has eliminated sexual assault, slavery, and other forms of violence on participating farms. And it has dramatically reduced other more common labor violations from sexual harassment to wage theft. The Fair Food Program is proof of concept for a new approach to protecting workers' rights in corporate supply chains everywhere. This new approach is called worker-driven social responsibility. It's already spread to the Vermont dairy industry, here in the US, and overseas to Bangladesh, where workers and brands came together and formed the Bangladesh Accord, which has saved countless workers' lives since the factory collapses and fires that happened just a few years ago. So this is where we come to the revolution that I mentioned earlier. In a dirt-poor town on the edge of the Everglades, a forgotten farm worker community has discovered a way to harness the purchasing power of some of the world's biggest corporations. And with that power, they're building a new world. Workers who had been beaten, raped, and robbed for generations by their bosses. We're no longer willing to accept outrageous indignities in the fields. Instead, protected by the very power that had kept them poor for decades, they demanded respect and they got it. And today, tens of millions of workers are working and facing unconscionable poverty and abuse at the bottom of corporate supply chains around the globe. And the very same approach that brought dignity and respect to the fields that were known as ground zero for modern-day slavery has been tested and proven to work in different industries and on different continents. When we, workers and consumers, speak with one voice, the billion-dollar brands have no choice but to listen. And what we're doing is telling them what we want. We want, and we believe it's time, for a human rights revolution at work. Thank you.
So we heard some David and Goliath stories this morning. We heard about the Kayaktivists, and I have no equally pithy name for these farm workers and what they are doing with their activism, but really, really powerful story. Thank you so much, Greg. Our next speaker is Rodney Foxworth. He serves as the executive director, and excuse me as I read my note here because I can't seem to remember this full acronym, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, which certainly sounds wonderful. I asked Rodney what is the hardest job that he has ever done, and without a single hesitation, he said, what I'm doing right now. So let's hear it.
I want to be clear, too, that I did have another response. And I do love my job. And I'm really happy whomever lined up the program to follow Greg because, one, he has a perfect voice for radio. And the work that he's doing is just really phenomenal and really speaks to the conversation that I want to instigate today. So I'm going to start. So we're talking about the future of work, and I think it's really important to understand how we got to where we are and what is the future of work if we're not also interrogating questions of ownership and power, as Greg articulately noted in his conversation. And so really, this conversation is really about the past, present, and future of wealth inequality. So I'm really pushing the boundaries of when we speak about the future of work. So I'm going to begin with this wonderful quote that people have heard many times from William Faulkner. The past is never dead. It's not even past. And I think that what Greg spoke about actually really frames things very well, because we sometimes feel as though things like worker theft of wages and slavery, forced work, that these things are of distant past, but in fact they are present with us today. So I'm going to go through for some grounding, where we are in terms of wealth inequality today. So some numbers. So these figures are based on 2017, so last year. 82% of all wealth created went to the richest 1%. The world's richest 500 billionaires' net worth grew 24% to nearly $5.4 trillion. And one of the things that's really interesting is many of you probably know about the Giving Pledge, for example. And since that was signed by the world's wealthiest folks, Bill Gates and others in, I think, 2010, individuals like Bill Gates and others have gotten so much wealthier that they can't even spend their money in the way that they wanted to in terms of philanthropically because they're getting wealthier and wealthier. So there's context for that as well. The world's billionaires saw their collective wealth increase by $762 billion. And the poorest 50% in the world saw no increase in wealth at all. So those are global figures, and I'm going to ground it in the conversation in the U.S. today. The median household wealth of African Americans is projected, if nothing were to change, will be 0 by 2053. You know, one of my friends, Aaron Walker, who runs a wonderful organization called Camelback Ventures based in New Orleans, when he situates this conversation, he likes to say, When you think about that, just a few generations away from ending slavery, African Americans are starting from ground zero. In Boston, obviously where we are, according to the Federal Reserve, the median household wealth for African Americans is already $8. And Boston, like many places, as liberal and progressive as many cities and communities are, has some of the worst segregation and economic disparity, particularly along racial lines. And then for Latinx, median wealth could reach zero by 2073. Now, there's a lot of positives within this context. African American women are actually the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs in the US, but only 2.5% of black women-owned businesses actually have employees. In between 2007 and 2012, privately held minority businesses contributed 1.3 million jobs to the American economy. Now, the reason why I position that is because when we look at racial discrimination and how it plays out in the system, and Greg spoke a lot about what he was talking about with systems change. You know, how do we go away from simply direct services? When you step back and look at the full system, how do we actually affect change via the system? So because of the discrimination that we face in the American economy, we're facing, as a collection of people, not just African Americans and Latinos, but we're facing loss. 1.1 million businesses owned by people of color due to discrimination, 9 million jobs. We would have more if we didn't have the kind of discrimination that's faced in our economy. And we're also losing out $300 billion in national income. Now, in retrospect, that's really to Jeff Bezos at this point, but that really kind of clarifies the kind of wealth inequality we're talking about today. I'm just going to pull out a couple of numbers here just to, again, to really ground, particularly for entrepreneurs and the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. We're really focused on entrepreneurship and small business and local ownership as a vehicle for addressing these systemic challenges. So when you look at the data, in 2015, the SBA reported that 70% of white applicants to their 7A lending program were approved compared to 2% of African Americans. And Echo and Green, which is a phenomenal social entrepreneurship organization, looked into their own data and determined that African American applicants from the US to the fellowship received half as much funding after 1 or 2 years as their white counterparts. Now, this is all happening in the context of the fact that we're quickly becoming a new majority. And so for the first time in history, people of color newborns are outpacing white newborns in the US. Actually, for the first time also, in terms of public education, first graders, students of color are the majority in this country today. Now, again, remember that figure that I pointed out, 2053 possibility if things continue the same, African American median household income wealth could drop to zero. Happens 3 years after we're supposed to become a majority people of color country in 2053, or 2050 rather. So let me just situate this conversation a little bit in the past as well. And again, pretty much a lot of things that actually Greg spoke about, I mean, these are things that are impacting us today. So one of the things I think about when Greg was speaking is the correlation and the analogy to sharecropping, which we're about a generation and a half, 2 generations out of. You know, my grandparents came out of that era. And so for those who don't understand, sharecropping was allegedly an opportunity after African Americans did not get 40 acres and a mule, was an opportunity, alleged opportunity in which African American farmers could actually benefit from profit sharing. They'd have to pay rents. Of course, there were never any profits, and so you really are just stuck in an indebtedness nature. And so this impacted African American households in particular, but not exclusively. My grandfather, who fought in Korea, was a Purple Heart, was denied his GI benefits because he was African American. And I think about this, he passed away last year, passed away in debt. My parents are working class, will likely have significant more liabilities than they do have assets. And I think even in my own household, what would have happened if this country had afforded my grandfather the privileges that he was owed. And so really situating the fact this is really a generation away. You know, we're not talking about something that was so far long ago, and it has real repercussions to where we are today. And of course, redlining and blockbusting, again, something that people think is a vestige of the past. And yet, just in 2011, Bank of America paid nearly over $300 million to settle charges of discriminatory lending practices. Wells Fargo paid $175 million. This year, Wells Fargo was sued by the city of Sacramento for a long-standing pattern and practice of discriminatory lending. This is today. This is not the past. It's a great quote. I was privileged to be able to attend the Equity Summit that PolicyLink put on earlier this year in Chicago, and Charlene Carruthers, who is with the Black Youth Project and does a number of other things for the fight for liberation, had a phenomenal quote. "It is not a risk to invest in Black and brown people fighting for liberation. It's the surest bet. When we have the resources to lead our own struggles, the world is transformed." That's exactly what Greg was speaking to. So I'm going to spotlight a couple of African-American women who I work with that are dear friends to me and an inspiration. And I bring this up because I actually find that women of color in particular are just doing some of the most transformative work in this country and across the globe. So I'm going to speak about Immokalee Agbu, and I have to give Immokalee Agbu and Alpha Damlash full credit for a concept that we've been really exploring at Bali. But this concept of restorative investing. And so as I laid out in some of the data and some of the historical context, you know, how do you actually restore what was extracted? You know, we oftentimes have these conversations without acknowledging that there needs to be some sort of restoration. I actually wanted to go with reparative, but restorative I think is a really good way of situating a real conversation for folks. So we're really looking at an approach focused on building economically empowered communities by democratizing capital and prioritizing racial justice. And so to do that, we have to acknowledge the past and how it lives with us and how it will continue to live with us unless we acknowledge and confront it head on. When we talk about equity, equity to me is about power. We also talk about diversity and inclusion. Those are actually the easiest things to accomplish, but it gets really difficult when you're talking about equity, because then you're talking about power, and that impacts everyone. And some folks are okay with letting go of power, and others hold on steadfast to it. There's this whole concept, and this goes back to why we're proponents of this concept of restorative investing. And in this world of impact investing, where the whole concept is that you can do well by doing good. And so then my challenge is, maybe we need to do well by giving up more, right? By restoring what was extracted from, not just in the past, but what's happening today. You could say that the folks that Greg's working with and those bonuses, for example, folks who are getting wage theft, it was owed to them. It wasn't even a bonus. It's what they were owed. One of the things that we work on quite a bit, and this is something that I'm surprised how little understanding there is about this concept of closing the friends and family capital gap for entrepreneurs of color. And again, thinking about what I noted about when you take away racial discrimination in our economy, what kind of new jobs, new income, new wealth opportunities will happen for everyone, not just African American and Latinos and other folks of color in this country. But oftentimes people don't recognize how the accumulation and preservation of wealth impacts entrepreneurship. And so oftentimes if you're an investor or something like that, or you started a business, you think about friends and family to help get you started. In the US alone, friends and family invest $60 billion a year into growing businesses. Now, if you look at the data, and it fluctuates depending, and so some of these numbers are actually off, but the general disparities are there. White median household wealth is $142,000. African American median household wealth, $11,000. Latinx median household wealth is $13,000. Friends and family. If you're an African American or Latinx entrepreneur, how do you actually get that friends and family capital? And again, situating the fact that there has been and continues to be wholesale discrimination that locks people of color out of accumulating wealth and actually even preserving and maintaining wealth before we even talk about accumulating. It's a moral question as much as an economic question. How do we resolve that? So we're talking about solutions though, right? So I want to focus a little bit on some folks that I am deeply inspired by. Jessica Norwood, who is a fellow at BALE, Conda Mason, and Ronnie Kroger. Again, women of color just doing it, really moving solutions along. So Jessica identified the friends and family gap as a significant barrier for African Americans creating new businesses in this country. So she did something about it. So she created the Runway Project in partnership with Conda and Ronnie. And really what the Runway Project has done, and it's in pilot stages right now in Oakland, though they're looking to expand nationally. Effectively what they've done is create an equity-like product that will sort of supplement what would have been friends and family investment for African American entrepreneurs. So they're doing this in Oakland right now, and so they've partnered up with Self-Help Credit Union, which effectively has created a certificate of deposit that when you invest into that CD, it actually becomes an investment for African American entrepreneurs. Currently, it's being done in the East Bay. Now, since we're in Boston, I need to speak about the solutionists here. And so there's a lot of activity happening here to build a community-controlled economy that's specifically working to advantage communities that have been historically extracted and currently extracted from. So Cero is one such business that some of our colleagues and fellow solutionists have been working with that really is about some of the things that Greg was alluding to, worker power, ensuring that that wealth that is accumulated with the business is actually shared with employees and not simply going back to a single owner. And really, a lot of this work has been led by a great community of people here in Boston. Deborah Fries with the Boston Impact Initiative, Aaron Tanaka with the Center for Economic Democracy, Nia Evans, who is a colleague of Aaron and Deborah, who runs Ujima Project, which is really an opportunity to democratize ownership and wealth accumulation in communities that have been historically impacted adversely by racial discrimination, right? And so these are relatively new opportunities. The Ujima Project started about 2 years ago, but they're working very actively and diligently with community residents that have been most hardest hit from some of these systemic challenges. And what the beauty about this is that for Deborah, for example, who was a high net worth individual, she was fortunate enough to have the kind of wealth where she could start her own fund with the Boston Impact Initiative. She's since started a second fund where even non-accredited investors can invest into, so anyone can invest into it as a charitable loan fund. And what it really aims to do is address the racial injustice happening in Boston. And so taking an eye and cue toward Black-owned businesses, Latino-owned businesses, looking at how to not just encourage and inspire ownership of individuals, but what does it look like if community members have full stake in those businesses as well? So really, how do we raise all boats at the same time? So just another picture of Nia, Deborah, and Aaron, who have been really pioneering in this work. And even though they're just getting started here in Boston, I mean, the reality is all of these folks have had enduring relationships in the community, which is why this has been able to happen. And communities across the country are really interested and inspired by how these folks are working. So the question that I leave before you, and maybe we'll have a chance to kind of get into it in our panel discussion, but the question I have is, how do we build a future economy that no longer extracts from and marginalizes communities? And when I ask that question, I ask it in the sense that it's not just because we actually need to take away the framework that we're trying to save Black and brown communities or anything like that. It's actually because we're all in this together, right? What will happen, for example, if by 2053, and the data were to continue, and the projections were to continue, and we're a majority people of color country, and we have the majority of people living in this country having net assets and wealth of zero? How will that impact all of us? So really, I'm calling to people's self-interest even in terms of how do we address this question? Because it's not just a Black and brown question, it's a question for all of us. And so how do we live into a future in which profit and accumulation of wealth is no longer prioritized above people, community, and planet. Thank you.
Just a small question that we'll try to take on later. Our next speaker is Krisztina Z. Holly, goes by Z. She's the host of the Art of Manufacturing podcast and founder and, I love this title, chief instigator at Make It in LA. And when I asked her what the hardest job she had ever done was, there were a few things that came out, and she finally settled on starting her first company, which I think tells you something about Z because she started quite a few of them at this point. Z, take it away.
Thank you so much. And the fact that I had many answers kind of says something about me. Tinkering is part of my nature. So I'm wondering how many of you have stared at a blank piece of paper and been intimidated by that piece of paper. And my junior year at MIT, I had the worst case of it because in my intro to design class, it was called 270 at the time, I was given a box of parts and I was told that I had to make a robot out of it. And as I looked into this box of parts, I was paralyzed by fear because I said, how am I ever going to do this? And the worst thing is that I had to take the class to graduate. So, and what's even worse is that the class ended in a huge tournament. There's sound. Let's try that again. Can you replay that? Robot versus robot. So it was incredibly intimidating. And to be honest, I really thought about changing my major at that point. And the thing was, I finally kind of calmed down and I went into the machine shop and I started to tinker. And as I started to play with the different pieces, I realized that as I played and I tinkered, I started not thinking about the end result. I stopped having that fear. And I started to imagine what actually this robot could look like. In fact, people started saying that I might win. And a TV crew started following me around. It was GBH, I believe, Discover the World of Science. And in fact, I did make it to the finals. Here I am in the finals. And here I am losing in the finals. It made a great story because they didn't have anything on the other guy, it turns out. And then they're like quickly trying to get some footage on him. So everyone expected me to win. And what I did learn, I learned a really important lesson, was that once I was able to let myself tinker, I then freed my imagination and freed my creativity and my ability to innovate. And that really stuck with me. The problem was that I was in for a rude awakening because that's not the way it worked in the real world. Here I was in my first job. I worked on the space shuttle main engine on the manufacturing team. I had to build a fixture for the welding robot. But the problem was that I was not allowed to go into the machine shop anymore. I had to design the part perfectly, send it off because the engineer designs the parts, the machinist creates the parts. And you hope that it comes back the way you designed it. And you know, it was incredibly stifling. And I felt like I stifled my creativity, and I did not like that feeling at all. And it really left an impression on me. And there's so many things I could have talked about today, but this was really the inspiration for this talk today, was this sense of tinkering. And what happened? So since 30 years later, I created 2 innovation centers at MIT and at USC, and I created the first ever TEDx with TED, and I helped curate and host that for 4 years. I now run a nonprofit that helps entrepreneurs that are manufacturing. And through this whole process, I've started to see a trend. I've worked with hundreds of pioneers and entrepreneurs, whether I was helping them, coaching them, or interviewing them, and I see this trend. A lot of people talk about the impacts of automation, they talk about robotics, AI, but I see a future that's driven by serious tinkering that allows us to iterate and innovate on things that in ways that we've never been able to before. And it doesn't just impact what we make, but it impacts how we make. And the question is, well, what does that actually mean for the future? I'm going to share a few examples, and I'll break it down into 3 different themes, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think it means for the future of innovation. Now, and the workforce. Now, the first website that I ever built was it was over 2 decades ago. I had to build it in HTML, and it took 4 months. It was incredibly frustrating, but those are the early days, right? Many of you know that today with tools like Squarespace, for example, you can get your company up and running in 4 hours, and it looks way better too, right? And it doesn't just have to do with coding. How many of you have used GarageBand ever for fun? Yeah, so the first time I ever played with GarageBand, within minutes I was making music. I'm no composer, but within a few hours I actually composed a song I liked so much, I ended up using it for my podcast as my theme song. So it's incredible how these tools, good tools, democratize the creation process. Now, it's really kind of easy. We take it for granted now in software, and just think about 20 years ago, like we didn't take that for my first hardware prototype. I had to code it in assembly language. It was frustrating. Like today, we take it for granted. These things are really easy to do in software. But what does it look like in hardware? And that's a little bit of a different story. So you might know what computer numerical control is. There's a video. It's a machine that allows you to manufacture very quickly very complex parts, and it's getting more and more complex. We're able to do some really amazing things. And so this isn't really anything new, but what's really challenging about it is programming this machine. That's the hard part. So in comes a company called Plethora, where they have their own, they're an automated CNC machine shop. They have their own design tools. You upload your design, it makes recommendations on what makes it easier to manufacture. It'll give you up-to-date quotes right away. And then you push a button, and 3 days later, you get your part, and it gets shipped to you. And so it's like incredible if you think about it. Like, what does it mean if you're able to not be an expert and be able to like I had to take design for manufacturability when I was an engineer. Like, you don't have to do that anymore to be able to get this part. You could take it a step further. What if you don't even have a design to start from? Well, you can go to a generative design tool, which is a video, and you can tell it certain specifications, and it'll use biology and evolutionary principles to grow a part for you. And in fact, it can grow a part that's stronger and stiffer and uses less material than you wouldn't have ever come up with this shape on your own necessarily. And so it's pretty amazing that you're able to do this. And it's not necessarily, I just want to make it clear, I'm showing you some examples of hardware kind of things. But there's tools for package design, there's tools and platforms for apparel that are starting to come out that I would love to tell more stories about. So it's not just limited. So what does this mean for the future? And it means that ideas can come from anywhere. It could be from people from very different backgrounds, from big companies, small companies. This is just a small smattering of some of the amazing people that I've discovered over the years that I've interviewed on my podcast, The Art of Manufacturing. And I have people who had a life sentence that are now employing hundreds of people in their company. I interviewed a woman who is the daughter of a truck driver and a man who was wanted to be a bartender, but now they're running a $9 billion space telescope. It's incredible. And these are not just, so these tools aren't just for coming up with the ideas and for individuals. I would love, maybe we have a chance later, but to tell stories also about how it's changing the way we innovate within our organizations. So now these tools enable people like marketing and creative to play a role in that product development process where they've never been able to play that role before. And that also means that these products and these ideas get closer to the problem, they get closer to the customer. And so it creates, it's a whole new way of innovating. And so, I'd like to think I'd like to look at another trend in software that might give another example of another theme, another serious tinkering theme. So I've been involved in many tech startups throughout the 90s, and in the same way that we, on the space shuttle, there was a separation of the imagining and the creating. We did the same thing in software, and we call it the waterfall method. The designer comes up, and the product team comes up with the specs, and then they pass it off to the developers, and the developers pass it off to QA, and sometimes it takes 18 months to get the software product to market. And you hope all along that you get what you ask for. In fact, you hope that you ask for the right thing, because the truth is that until you get that product into the hands of the customer, you don't know if it makes sense at all. And imagine investing so many time and resources into something that you don't even know if it was the right product to make. And so that's where something called agile development comes in, which is you get it into the hands of the customer, a minimum viable product, and you keep iterating, and you might have heard of this approach, and it's very common in software today, and you keep iterating. It's creating becomes learning, and it's a very different process, very different innovation process. Now, this iteration is not so hard in software. You make a tweak, you push a button, you push it to the cloud, it's out there. What does it look like in hardware? And it's really, it's a lot harder, because you have to invest a lot up front in order to sometimes get that product to market. And so, but the good news is that there are tools. So here's a company called EDELBROCK. They're an aftermarkets auto parts company. And so what they do is, before they ever commit to metal, they create 3D printed plastic prototypes that they can put and they can test and they iterate. They can get probably 30 tests out of one of these parts before they commit to the metal. And so that is incredibly powerful in being able to bring that same iterative process into the physical realm. Now, but that said, so I just got an email literally this morning. I backed a Kickstarter, and I just got this email. It says, "We just took quite an important step called tooling. Tools are heavy steel forms which are used to inject the plastic for the casing. From now on, there are no more changes in the mechanical parts. Now it's time to wait and see the first parts come out of the new tools." So as you can see, there's still this investment process, this stifling this process. But what's really exciting, this is where it gets interesting. So, so normally a part like this, it could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to create the tooling for part. For an actual car, it could be $500 million in tooling in order to create a car. But imagine if you can, you don't ever have to create any tooling at all, and that's where it does become interesting. So I recently, just a couple months ago, visited Desktop Metal, which is a company in Waltham. You might have heard of them. They are a really cutting-edge 3D printing company. They're not printing in plastic anymore. They're printing in almost any kind of metal you can imagine. It's safe. It sits on the desktop. It's only $140,000, which is incredibly inexpensive for this kind of technology. And what's more, I ended up seeing this as sort of next generation full mass production machine, which is being released early next year, which is going to allow companies to print as fast and cheaper with a desktop printer, or not desktop, but with this 3D printer than it would for casting or machining. And so now it's incredibly just transparent. This whole process from prototype to mass production is just a continuum now, and you can go back and forth. And so there is no final word in we're going now to production. And so it really changes the way we can make and innovate. And so of course this has some pretty big ramifications. What does that mean for the future? Well, it means that we're shifting to this new technically easier world where we can just switch to going to production, but it's not easy from the human scale. And so when you're actually doing this in an organization, it's really hard for organizations to change the way they do things because it makes us have to put off decisions. We have to feel comfortable with ambiguity. And we also have to learn how to listen and take the customer input, it can be very disruptive to our organizations. But what it does also mean is that manufacturing locally means a lot more. It's a lot more beneficial. So we're closing the loop from the design to the production to the customer and then back to the designer again. And this isn't just for hardware. I've talked again a lot about hardware. This is also in many other industries, including apparel. McKinsey just came out with a study about a week ago that said that 80% of their the global apparel manufacturers are planning to nearshore or reshore their manufacturing for speed in the next several years, because they see the benefits of that real rapid iteration in the process. Now, this is, people say, well, okay, manufacturing, and I'd like to talk about that maybe a little bit more too, and if we have time in the panel, but yes, manufacturing is more expensive, or this and that. We don't do manufacturing here anymore. Let's talk about that. Actually, rising labor costs overseas, advanced manufacturing and automation is making it more relevant and much more appealing to manufacture locally. And I want to throw out the concept that we have to stop thinking about jobs. There will be jobs, there will be more jobs, but that's not the most important thing, and I can explain that later. But it does mean that we have more nimble innovation when we're manufacturing locally. We have more sustainable innovation because we're not shipping things all the way around, and we are also have much more better national security when we have the means of production locally. So very important. Now, if manufacturing is completely flexible and we can design, anyone can design anything in the future, let's look to the future, what does that look like? Imagine you could have shoes fit to your feet, manufactured on demand, or clothes knitted to your specifications and your figure. Or maybe you have food, meals that are prepared for your medical needs and your preferences and packaged and delivered to you weekly if you don't like to cook, or even if you do like to cook, but it's maybe better for you. Or perhaps you have designer drugs, or you have custom implants. These are all companies that are on the market now, and many more that are in stealth. There's one that I can't say a lot of detail about, but one is actually taking your stem cells and 3D printing a new lung for a lung transplant. So these are the kinds of crazy things that are on the horizon, and in some cases they're already here. And what does that mean? So Amazon has trained us for on-demand delivery. We expect that. But the future really is about, I believe, is on-demand manufacturing. It means that it's personalized. It means when you have what you want, when you want it. It means that there's going to be less waste, and you're going to be meeting the needs and the problems of the future much more effectively. And I also say that design is more important than ever. And you might say, well, why is design so important? Like, just put these tools in the hands of the customer, because now anybody can design anything, right? Well, there's an entrepreneur who I interviewed on my podcast a couple years ago, but she learned the hard way that it doesn't work so easily. Her name was Jodie Fox, and her company, Shoes of Prey, did something that nobody thought was possible. They created a factory to make shoes, custom, one-off shoes in 2 weeks. So you design exactly the shoe you want, and they will ship it off to you in 2 weeks. And things are going great, except they didn't realize that people don't really want to design their shoes. Would you rather wear your shoes that you designed, or maybe for Ferragamo shoes, or what somebody else who actually knows what the style is and has a brand? So they kind of missed the mark, and they shipped millions of individual, I mean, it's amazing, actually technologically amazing, millions of individual shoes to people before they stopped taking orders a couple months ago. And it's so sad. It's so sad to me, because I loved the business model, but clearly they and I got the human element wrong. And so based on what they're learning, they're retooling and rethinking the business model. They stopped taking orders, but in the future, the technology is going to be there, and now we have to figure out how do we bridge the gap with the design. And so what does that mean for the future of work? And I would say that now more than ever, designers are translating our desires and our dreams into real solutions. And new tools like artificial intelligence and big data and graphical interfaces and automation are making it easier. And it's a true collaborative effort between human and machine. It's more diverse than ever. It's more localized in many cases. It will be more localized than ever. And it's also more sustainable than ever. Now, I think there will be plenty of STEM jobs available because we need to create those tools. But I think even more, the real key is going to be the creativity, the collaboration, and empathy. Greg talked about that. Those are going to be the key 21st century skills, and those can't be automated. Now, every day, we all look, as leaders, as creative storytellers, we're all looking into this random box of parts. We never have all the tools or all the resources that we need. But I believe that if we look to these new tools and we harness these new serious tinkering methods, we can really tap into our full creative potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Z. Our final speaker is Byron Auguste, and he is the CEO of Business at Work. And where did Byron go? Oh, there you are. And when I asked him what his hardest job was, he said it was the 2 years that he spent in the Obama White House as the deputy director of the National Economic Council, which he said made both being a paperboy and working at a major financial firm both look like Mediterranean pleasure cruises. So they work hard in the White House.
Yeah, that's right. We worked a lot harder in the White House. I keep hearing about all these cushy public sector jobs, but I haven't been able to get one just yet. Turns out it's quite a bit of work. And work is, in fact, the topic of this conversation. And the organization that I founded is called Opportunity at Work. And it's got a little ampersand, as you can see, which means it's obviously very with it and contemporary and modern. And so obviously you should listen to what I say because it's the future. Look at that and, it's the future. But before we get to the future, I think it's worth a little bit about the present. And because there's some fundamental human experiences that I think we can all relate to at some level. For example, have you ever been in a situation where you really saw that you could do something? Like you were looking, it's like, I think I can do that, but that no one would give you a chance to do it for some reason or another. They didn't trust you, they didn't think you were ready, whatever it might be. Frustrating feeling. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to actually apply for a job. Not like get a job through your networks like I think most of us had, but actually apply for a job online and see what that experience is like, going from place to place. If you have, you'll know it's an incredibly frustrating experience. It's a demoralizing experience. It's 200 rifle shots in the dark, and you have no idea ever. Like, were you close? Were you not close? What do I need to do differently? There's no feedback, right? There's no feedback. That's a very frustrating feeling. And then there's a lot of people, maybe not people in this room, who feel like they're stuck. They do have a job. Most Americans have a job, but they're stuck. They're on a treadmill. They're being trained for safety, compliance, and efficiency, but they're not being trained, they're not being invested in to go anywhere. So that is the present of work. So when we talk about the future of work, I think the very first thing we need to do is understand the present. This is our present. The American dream is something we've talked about a lot, and it means a lot of different things to different people. But I think that the arithmetic of the American dream is fundamentally that children are typically better off than their parents. And that's been playing itself out. If you look at this chart, you see in 1970, if you were 30 years old in the United States, you had a 91% chance to be earning more than your parents were. That slipped. By the time 1990 came around, it was 62%. As of 2010, a 30-year-old in the United States had a coin flip, a 50% chance of earning more than their parents. And we don't have the data beyond that yet, but it is almost certainly the case that we're in the first generation of Americans for quite some time where the median American is not earning more than their parents. So when you hear the anxiety about the future, this is the reality that is generating the anxiety. This is the reality that is damaging our economy, that is poisoning our politics. This is the reality that has generated the most overwhelming wave of pessimism we've seen in this country for quite a long time. And the question is the future. Today, the vast majority of people say that they don't expect their children necessarily to have a better life than they did. That's not assumed anymore. And it's also not assumed that effort that they make is going to lead to progress. And so there's a lot of fear when we talk about the future of work. And the most obvious form of that fear, the one we hear about the most, is that machines are going to take our jobs. The robots are going to take our jobs. And the fact of the matter is, they're probably not going to take most of our jobs. If you look at the big trends in artificial intelligence that are really taking off, those are really parts of jobs. They're very rarely whole jobs. So artificial intelligence really doesn't want to take our jobs. But the fear, I think, that is more real is not that machines will take our jobs, but that we will be cogs in a machinery. And I think there's a lot to fear about that. Because if you look at the current state of work, people are inputs as opposed to the objectives. And so one message that I think everyone should take away is that work is solving problems. And if you look around you, read your papers, we're not running out of problems. We're really not, right? I mean, work is inventing things, it's improving things, it's fixing things, it's building things, it's caring for people, it's healing, it's educating, it's entertaining. There is so much work to do in this country and around the world. I think the real question isn't, is there going to be work to do in the future? The real question is, why are our institutions, our companies, our markets, our government, why are they doing such a poor job of translating from all the work there is to be done to meaningful work for everyone in this country? That's the question. And to me, it's a very poignant question because the whole narrative about technology kind of undermining the American dream doesn't ring true to me. My own family story took a turn, an upward trajectory into the American middle class in 1970 when my father, who had spent a year at college mainly to convince my mother she ought to marry him, but had dropped out of college and was working in a factory, and he saw an ad in a newspaper say, "Learn COBOL. You can write your own ticket." So I had to find out what COBOL was. It turned out it was a programming language, a computer programming language for the IBM mainframe that there was a huge demand for. And my mother had a decent job. My dad actually quit his job, spent 6 months learning COBOL, and then was able to get a chance, first a job shadow, then sort of an apprenticeship / entry-level job in the MIS department of Detroit Edison, where we lived. And that was where the turn came in our path into the middle class. So what happened here? What went right? There was a tremendous amount of public investment in research and development. There was a tremendous amount. IBM as a company put a lot of chips on that. They really took a risk in inventing something that was a platform that really changed the world. You had an entrepreneur who saw that there was a need for more people with those skills who started up these training programs. You had educators who went to work there. You had, fortunately, women could work. My mom had a job. We could make it through. And what else then? My dad took a risk, but he took a chance, but the company also took a chance on him. And that's how it happened. So what's happening now? We have a lot of good data that's coming with this new administrative data sets, really amazing. And I would urge all of you in the media to really start to dig in to some of this. Raj Chetty is someone you may have heard of, and there's a lot of work associated with him that tells us a lot about what's happening. And it turns out when you look at it, how likely you are to actually earn more than your parents is only about 22% about your education. Only about 22%. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in that 45%, which is about your wealth. It's about who you marry. It's about where you live. There's a bunch of those things that are sort of structural in nature. But then there is this 33% of the earnings gap. I want to call that the opportunity gap. We talk about the skills gap, but with the same skills, a lot of people can't convert those skills, that learning, into earning. Why? You may have your theories, and a lot goes into it. There's racial discrimination, there's gender discrimination. There are, we talk about implicit bias, and that is a real thing. But one of the things I want to talk to you about today is explicit bias, which is there's 100 million Americans that don't have bachelor's degrees. And it is absolutely allowed to say, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you need not apply for this job. You will not be considered. You will be screened out. We can't say that for black people. We can't say that for women. We can't say that for anyone, nor should we. But we do. And that's the structure of our market, and that's a big part of what's going on here. So Lashana Lewis is someone who I've worked with at Opportunity Work. She, for 10 years, and I'll get back to her in a minute, but for 10 years, Lashana, who also had a year of college, interestingly, but who had more technical skills, she went to a technical college, unlike my dad, and she had to drop out of college because her mom got sick. She had to come back and take care of her family. But she went back to St. Louis, and she thought, at least I've got the skills. I can get a job. For 10 years, she worked in call centers. She worked as a bus driver. In fact, she worked as a bus driver for a school that had a computer class, and she was the substitute teacher for the computer class, right? Did a great job. Now, when the teacher left, she applied for that job. They said, sorry, you don't have a bachelor's degree. She said, but you know I can do it. Yeah, we do. It's such a shame, okay? 10 years, Lashana tried to get a job in tech. So there's a lot more people than Lashana that can't really convert their learning into earning in the way that our labor market works right now. So for example, we have probably up to 40 million people, we don't even keep the statistics that well, of people who went to college but didn't get a college degree. They are much closer to high school graduates than they do to college graduates. That learning counts for very little without the credential. Who knows what this number is, but for sure, we have well over 10 million people that have a very relevant set of skills, but they need to be retooled. Now, if you happen to be with a company that's investing in that retooling, that's great. If you're not, you're currently out of luck. And then there are probably 15, 20 million caregivers, lead parents, who have all sorts of skills that would like to either part-time or full-time come into the market. Very hard time converting it. Others, we have young people who are just trying to get traction in the labor market. They're not in school. They're not in a job. It's, oh, you can't get a job. You don't have experience. How do I get experience if I don't get a job, right? We've all heard that. Long-term unemployed in a very difficult situation. And then one bright spot, we have about 1.5 million veterans that are at any given point that are out of work or migrating in. There's been a big push in the last 5 years to actually have the Iraq and Afghan era veterans really assessed for what they can do and not just pigeonholed based on their resumes. And that's been extremely successful. And we now have the levels of unemployment down below the national average. Now, there's nothing about what we've done with veterans and to some extent military families, which is an amazing, positive thing. There's nothing we couldn't do with everybody else on this page, all 80 million. So, future of work, when you're thinking about it, don't blame the tools. Technology is not gravity. Technology does what we ask it to. What we need to do is fix the rules. And what are the rules that need fixing? When we think about rules, most people think about government. They think about regulation. They think about laws, right? But in fact, markets are sets of rules too. And in markets, government sets some of the rules, but companies set far more of them. And the labor market is a market. Like you hear about a skills gap, markets have a supply side, but they also have a demand side. And when a market is broken, as the labor market is, it's always broken on both sides, and typically you can't fix it without the demand side. So we can't train our way to solve this problem. The rules of how companies hire, how they screen, all of these are very fundamental, and this market is fundamental to our economy. We think about, we think about the auto market, it's a huge market, it is. It's probably the biggest consumer market. We think about healthcare, it's a massive market. $2 trillion, real estate even bigger, but the labor market is a $9 trillion market. It's the market through which all the investments in human capital from your kindergarten through your college to your internships to your network. All of those are realized in a financial sense there. And it's a market that has a weird relationship to supply and demand because, you know, economists model the labor market as if people would rather sit on their rear ends and only through money do they work, right? They're the supply side to an economist. But in fact, we know from all the psychological studies and from our own lives that actually meaningful work is really something people demand as much as they demand healthcare, as much as they demand love, as much as they demand every other important thing in their life. So we need to take it more seriously than we do. And so what are the rules that are broken? Number one, companies have adopted a strategy, American companies in particular, that is much more focused on selection of the talent that exists and how to compete for the talent that's already been trained, as opposed to investment in the talent that has potential and can be developed. 40 years ago, half of all hiring was out of schools, was out of high schools, was out of college. Today, it's 7% of hiring is out of schools. 93% is some version of, we're looking for someone with 10 years of progressive experience in these roles. You might have a job that's existed for 2 years, and you say what you have to have done for the last 10 years of your life. That's not even a demand signal, right? Until we have a time machine, that's not a demand signal. That's a search algorithm, and it's searching for some Americans, and it's excluding others systematically. And which Americans are being excluded and on what basis? And that is how we do the selection. We don't select based on performance. We could give everyone a shot at trying to sort of show what they can do and then sort through who's ready to do what. But we don't. We screen people out based on their history, based on their pedigree, based on what degrees they have, where they have them, what work they have, where they did it. That's your history. And here's why this means that the skills gap narrative is really not quite right. Because if we were actually screening based on people's skills, well, you can improve your skills. That's called learning. But if we're screening based on your history, you can't improve your history. That's called lying, right? So we're actually defining our way into a skills gap. And then the third problem is, where do we spend? Where do we invest? And for what purpose? Well, the answer is it's for invested capital, capital that companies can own, property, plant, and equipment, software, patents and the like. And that is what we're optimizing. Like, for the last 40 years, all the institutions of the American economy, from the stock market to private equity to all the consultants to all the technologists, are trying to do that, optimize the return on invested capital, corporate capital, not human capital. And by human capital, that's the capital that companies cannot own. It's capital we own. It's what we carry with us wherever we go. It's what we can walk out the door with every night. And that's not where the investment is going. In fact, per person, it's about a 30% real decline in corporate training, as one example. And by the way, it's a huge bifurcation where the training has gone to the top and the middle and not at the bottom. Well, that sucks for people who don't get it, but it's bad for the rest of us too. Because in fact, human capital, in terms of the productive capacity of our economy and our future potential, it's worth about 3 to 4 times invested capital. The $50 trillion that companies own is dwarfed by the $150 to $200 trillion in value of the capital, human capital stock. But remember, that's distributed to all of us, right? We all have a piece of that. And in fact, talent is far more equally distributed than opportunity, and it's exceedingly more fairly distributed than financial capital. And when people say, well, we're doing lots of training, aren't we doing that? Well, the answer is mostly no. Companies are doing a lot of training, by the way. It's like $500 billion a year. Companies spend about 25 times as much on training as all of government training put together. I remember when I was in Washington, people kept wanting to debate about the boxes of government training programs and shouldn't we combine these boxes or the others. It's like, well, why? They're sort of a pimple on the butt of the problem, right? They're tiny, tiny, tiny compared to the actual economy. $9 trillion market, $500 billion in corporate training, maybe $20 billion in all government training programs put together. So now look at California, which actually does invest relative to most states pretty well. These are 7 million, the big circle here is 7 million low-income adults in California. That's not the middle, right? That's just the bottom. And now California community college system, which is 20% of all community college students in the country, that's about 2 million. But now look at those little tiny bubbles there. Those are workforce development programs, and apprenticeships, right? Both good things, very tiny, barely scratching the surface. And I think a lot of why we barely scratch the surface is because we've gotten into a mindset that says, well, actually, the people with the talent, the ability that should be invested in already have a bunch of money, they already have good jobs, and that's why we're competing for them. It's like, you know, if you don't make much money, well, you don't have much skill. But that also is not true. I don't know how many of you have cousins. I have cousins. I have hundreds of cousins, actually. And it's a large enough data set for me to tell you that while studying hard is a good thing, working hard is a good thing, all sorts of things happen, and people are all over the map. And also, if you give someone a clear window into what they could accomplish, what progress they can make, I don't know anyone. I honestly don't know a single person who would not work for it, to my knowledge. You may know tons, I know none, and I know a lot of people. So people are actually potential. We talk in Washington, and sometimes we talk in companies, and we talk in panel discussions as if people are problems. But people are not problems. People have problems, but people are not problems. People are problem solvers. Every problem that's ever been solved has been solved by people. Everything you see around you, like people have been, by the way, people have been going to college in any meaningful numbers for about 5 minutes in human history. So 95% of what you see around you has been created by people without college degrees. And in fact, this quote unquote unprecedented problem we're facing about the future of work is dwarfed by the problem we faced 100 years ago in this country, where agriculture mechanized, and in a 30-year span, you had about 25% of the workforce that needed to be replaced. And we actually rose to the occasion. And we did it not just with technology, we didn't have that much technology, and we did it not with a bunch of fancy education. We didn't have many people with that. This was done by mainly people with elementary school educations, but what they did was create a high school movement. And you had some people right here in Massachusetts who invented this high school concept. They took, you know, the private academies and sort of stripped out Greek and Latin and added some practical subjects. But then across the country, people held town meetings, and they elected school boards, and they decided to tax themselves, and they built high schools. And those high schools became the source of the workforce for automotive, for communications, and the like. So we have solved the problem before, and the way we need to do it is by creating institutions. If you want to invest in a stock, you've got a lot of help to do it. If you want to invest in yourself, you have very little, and particularly for those 100 million people that are not with college degrees. We need to change that. There's absolutely no reason why we can't unlock in this country universal career guidance. Have you heard of Wikipedia? Hundreds of thousands of volunteers work on that. We've tested an opportunity at work having volunteer recruiters to give people feedback, give people mock interviews. They don't get feedback in a job interview. People love to do it. In half an hour of your time, you can change the course of another person's life. It's amazing, and it does make a difference. There's no reason, too, that we couldn't have, when someone is not quite ready, instead of just throwing them back in the pile, identify their gaps, that 15% they need to fill, and fill them. Institutions that fill in skills, last mile institutions, and there's a lot going on there. And then finally, flip the labor market. So instead of just shots in the dark, hey, show what you can do. Build a portfolio of skills and have companies come and compete for that. There's no reason we can't flip it. It's a combination of technology and regulation and the like. And if we do, here's the results we can get. We have Lashana Lewis, who I talked about before. She actually went to a nonprofit called Launch Code, this program called Coder Girl, and just had a chance to show what she could do. They're a partner of ours in Opportunity at Work. And after 10 years of trying, she got a job as a systems engineer at MasterCard. She got 2 promotions, and then she has just, after a few years at MasterCard, left, and she's now the chief technology officer of a startup company that is opening up avenues in tech in St. Louis. That's the kind of talent we're missing. 10 years, we lost Lashana Lewis. There was this other fellow, Alexander Hamilton, just to close the loop, thinking about America, America's future, America's past. Alexander Hamilton started from a place of poverty, started from a place of exclusion. A catastrophe, a hurricane, gave him a chance to show what he could do. He wrote a long letter describing this in his local paper. And the grandees of this town said, who is this kid? And they actually put together money for scholarship. That was like a skills-based thing. And they sent him to the United States. And he happened to be here when the American Revolution started, and the rest is history. Now, what if it had taken Alexander Hamilton 10 years to show what he could do? If he would have missed the whole revolution, we might have lost the war, and none of us would be here talking about this. So it actually really matters. And so what I want to urge in closing is that we actually do flip the labor market. We turn it on its head. We change the way we invest in, we put investment first. We go for performance over pedigree, and we actually invest in human capital for all of us. And if we do that, we actually can change the world and not throw away our shot. Thank you.